Take your necklace back. 300 guests watched as Hannah Brooks unclasped the $1 million diamonds from her neck and placed them into Marcello Rinaldi's hand. 47 minutes earlier, she had entered the gala as the mafia boss's hired date. Now she understood why he had really chosen her. Not for companionship, not because he needed help surviving another tedious society event. Marcello had selected her to humiliate another woman. Hannah returned the necklace, handed back the keys to the luxury car waiting outside, and walked toward the exit. Nobody walked away from the most feared mafia boss in New York, especially not in front of 300 witnesses. 2 of Marcello's men instinctively moved toward the door. He stopped them with one look. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, Marcello Rinaldi did something even more unexpected. He went after her himself. 47 minutes earlier, Hannah Brooks had believed the evening would be easy money. 4 hours, 1 charity gala, 1 wealthy client who apparently required a woman capable of surviving a ballroom full of people who considered small talk a competitive sport. Hannah had handled worse assignments. As a professional event companion, she had attended weddings with recently divorced executives, award ceremonies with painfully shy surgeons, and corporate dinners beside men who could negotiate billion-dollar mergers but somehow forgot how chairs worked when an attractive woman entered the room. Marcello Rinaldi, however, was different. She understood that before he said a word. At 42, Marcello possessed the kind of presence that made people unconsciously create space around him. Exceptionally handsome, perfectly controlled, and publicly known as a billionaire with enormous interests in finance and real estate, he carried another reputation that polite society rarely discussed above a whisper: the Rinaldi crime family. Hannah knew enough not to ask questions. Her agency had given her simple instructions: attend the gala, help him appear socially approachable, avoid unnecessary attention, leave after 4 hours. Professional, straightforward. Marcello apparently believed so too. When Hannah arrived, he greeted her with the efficiency of a man beginning a board meeting. "The car will return you home at 11. "Good evening to you too." He paused. Hannah smiled pleasantly. Something almost imperceptible changed in his expression. Most people, she realized, probably became nervous when Marcello Rinaldi looked directly at them. Hannah became curious. Before entering the ballroom, an assistant presented her with a velvet case containing a diamond necklace so extravagant, Hannah briefly wondered whether it came with its own security detail. "It complements the dress," Marcello explained. Hannah examined him. "You say romantic things like a tax accountant." His assistant immediately looked away. Marcello stared at her for 2 silent seconds. Then he almost smiled. Almost. That should have been Hannah's first warning. The evening began surprisingly well. Hannah discovered that intimidating, powerful men became significantly less intimidating once you noticed how much they hated meaningless conversation. Marcello endured wealthy donors with the solemn patience of someone negotiating hostage releases. Hannah quietly translated their conversations afterward. The real estate developer who spent 12 minutes discussing his vineyard had apparently meant, "Please understand that I am extremely rich." The investment banker who mentioned Harvard 3 times had meant, "Please ask me about Harvard." By the 4th translation, Marcello was visibly fighting amusement. By the 6th, he failed. It was only a brief laugh, but 3 people nearby turned to look. Apparently Marcello Rinaldi, laughing in public, qualified as an unusual event. Hannah found that much funnier than she should have. And for perhaps the first time in years, Marcello forgot that he had brought a woman beside him for a purpose. Then Isabel Devereaux entered the room. Hannah noticed the change immediately. Not because Marcello became nervous. Men like Marcello probably considered nervousness an administrative error. He simply became more deliberate. His hand moved lightly to Hannah's back. A photographer approached. Marcello, who had avoided cameras all evening, suddenly remained exactly where he was. Flash. Across the ballroom, Isabel was watching. Hannah noticed. 10 minutes later, Marcello brought her champagne himself when Isabel stood nearby. Another photograph. Another glance across the room. Then, during a conversation with several donors, Marcello leaned closer to Hannah and said something completely unnecessary, simply to create the appearance of intimacy. Hannah smiled for the people around them, but her amusement had disappeared. Patterns were part of her profession. She knew the difference between a client trying to look socially comfortable and a man performing for one specific observer. Marcello wasn't watching Hannah. He was watching Isabel watch Hannah. And suddenly, the $1 million necklace around Hannah's throat felt considerably heavier. Hannah had spent enough years working around wealthy people to recognize an insult before it was spoken. The most sophisticated ones rarely sounded cruel. They arrived wrapped in compliments. Isabel Devereux approached during a lull between speeches, carrying a champagne glass and the effortless confidence of a woman who had never entered a room wondering whether she belonged there. Up close, she was elegant rather than flashy. Everything about her suggested old money, the kind that had stopped needing to prove itself several generations ago. Her eyes moved briefly over Hannah, the dress, the diamonds, Marcello's hand resting near Hannah's waist. Then she smiled. "You're much better than I expected." Hannah returned the smile. That sentence had several possible meanings. None of them were compliments. I'm glad I could exceed expectations I didn't know existed. For the first time, Isabel looked genuinely amused. Perhaps that was why she decided Hannah deserved the truth. Her gaze drifted toward Marcello, who had been intercepted several yards away by two men from the charity board. He always did prefer efficient solutions. Hannah felt something settle quietly in her stomach. What problem am I solving? Isabel looked back at her. Oh, a perfect pause. He didn't tell you. There it was. Not information. A weapon disguised as sympathy. Hannah could have walked away. Instead, she waited. Isabel explained very little. She didn't need to. For years, their families had encouraged speculation that she and Marcello would eventually marry. Society had repeated the possibility so often that rumor had hardened into expectation. Marcello had never agreed to it, but he had never publicly destroyed it either. Until tonight. Until Hannah. Isabel glanced again at the necklace. He could have brought anyone. Her smile remained perfectly civilized. A model, an actress, one of the women who usually circles men like him. Then her eyes returned to Hannah. But that wouldn't have made the point quite so unmistakable. Hannah understood, and Isabel knew she understood. Marcello had not merely needed a date. He had needed contrast. Someone unexpected enough that his appearance with her would destroy the social narrative surrounding Isabel in a single evening. Hannah's profession made the arrangement convenient. Her appearance made it visible. And nobody had thought it necessary to tell her that she had been hired as ammunition. For one ugly second, humiliation burned through her. Not because she was ashamed of her body, not because Isabel's opinion mattered, and certainly not because Hannah believed standing beside Marcello Rinaldi somehow elevated her value. The humiliation came from realizing she had entered the room, believing she understood the terms of the transaction. She had been wrong. She had agreed to perform companionship. She had not agreed to participate unknowingly in someone else's punishment. Across the ballroom, Marcello looked toward her. Their eyes met. Hannah watched him glance at Isabel. That tiny movement confirmed everything. Marcello excused himself from the men surrounding him.
He began walking toward her. Hannah was already removing the necklace. Something in his expression changed. He understood too late. "Take your necklace back." Nearby conversations died almost instantly. Hannah placed the diamonds into his hand. Marcello looked down at them, then at her. "Hannah, the car keys are with your driver." His voice lowered. "What happened?" That almost made her laugh. Not because anything was funny, because Marcello Rinaldi genuinely appeared to believe the problem had happened to him. "You should ask Isabel. Apparently she knows more about my job tonight than I do." Marcello's eyes moved toward Isabel. That was enough. Hannah turned and walked away. She did not hurry. She did not cry. She did not give 300 wealthy strangers the spectacle they were already desperate to witness. Behind her, 2 of Marcello's security men instinctively shifted toward the exit. One look from Marcello stopped them. Then he followed her himself. Outside, the night air hit Hannah with the relief of stepping out of a room where she had been holding her breath without realizing it. She had nearly reached the curb when Marcello caught up. "Hannah." She kept walking. The agreement was 4 hours. That stopped her. She turned. Marcello immediately knew he had chosen the wrong sentence. His mind worked rapidly, searching for the correct solution. Unfortunately, Marcello solved emotional problems using the same instincts that had built an empire. Identify the loss, calculate the price, close the negotiation. "I'll double the fee." Hannah stared at him. For perhaps 3 full seconds, neither spoke. Then she gave a small, incredulous laugh. Marcello frowned. "I'm not negotiating. That somehow makes it worse. If the amount is insufficient—" "Oh, wow." She looked away briefly, almost impressed by the scale of the disaster. "You actually think I'm leaving because you didn't pay me enough?" Marcello said nothing. Hannah stepped closer. "I agreed to be your companion tonight. That was a job. I knew what I was selling you. 4 hours of my time, my social skills, and the appearance of company." Her voice remained calm. "That doesn't mean you bought the right to lie about what you were using me for." "I didn't lie. You withheld the truth because you knew I might say no." That silenced him. For a man who could dismantle negotiations with a sentence, Marcello had no immediate answer. Hannah nodded once. "Exactly." He looked genuinely confused by one part of it. "You were still performing the service you agreed to perform." Hannah studied him. And suddenly she saw the real problem. He wasn't pretending not to understand. He truly didn't. To Marcello, an agreement was defined by measurable obligations. She attended. He paid. Neither had technically violated the contract, but Hannah lived in a world Marcello apparently had never needed to understand, a world where something could be technically permitted and still deeply disrespectful. "A transaction doesn't cancel dignity, Marcello." The sentence landed harder than anger would have. Hannah stepped backward. "You wanted to send Isabel a message. Congratulations. She got it." A taxi slowed near the curb. "And now I'm sending you one." She opened the door herself. "My time can be rented." She looked at him one final time. "My self-respect can't." Then she left. Marcello remained on the sidewalk as the taxi disappeared into Manhattan traffic. Behind him waited 300 guests, several influential families, dozens of cameras, and Isabel Devereaux. Strategically, the evening had succeeded. By morning, nobody would seriously believe he intended to marry Isabel. The rumor he had wanted, destroyed, was finished. Marcello Rinaldi had achieved exactly what he wanted. So it disturbed him considerably that, for the first time in years, victory felt almost identical to losing. Marcello Rinaldi didn't chase women. He also didn't obsess over failed conversations. When negotiations ended badly, he analyzed the mistake, corrected the strategy, and moved on. Hannah Brooks should have been no different. For the next 11 days, she was extremely different. Her final sentence followed him into meetings. My time can be rented. My self-respect can't. What bothered Marcello most was not that she had embarrassed him publicly. People had challenged him before. Some had survived professionally. A smaller number had remained socially relevant afterward. What bothered him was the possibility that Hannah had been right. He had paid for a service and received exactly what the contract promised. Yet somehow, he had still taken something he had never been given: consent to the purpose. The distinction irritated him because it could not be solved by examining paperwork. His consigliere, Luca Moretti, noticed the problem on day 4. Marcello was reviewing property acquisitions when he stopped on an invitation to a children's hospital fundraiser. Normally, such invitations were handled by his charitable foundation. Marcello donated money. Other people attended. That arrangement had worked beautifully for years. Who is managing this event? Luca looked at him. The hospital? The event company. A pause. I can find out. Do that. Luca did. Hannah's agency was providing several professional companions for donors attending alone. Marcello attended the fundraiser. He told himself this was coincidence. Luca did not insult either of them by commenting. Hannah saw Marcello within 12 minutes. He was standing beside a pediatric surgeon, appearing deeply interested in a conversation about donor outreach. Hannah nearly walked into a waiter. Marcello Rinaldi had once left a $75,000 charity dinner before dessert because, according to someone Hannah knew, he considered organized philanthropy inefficient theater. Now he was discussing balloon arrangements. Their eyes met across the room. Marcello gave her a restrained nod. Hannah returned it. Neither approached. 3 days later, Marcello attended an Arts Foundation dinner. Hannah was there too. 5 days after that, he appeared at a museum benefit. Hannah was beginning to suspect New York had developed a serious billionaire infestation. Marcello always had explanations. The Rinaldi Foundation supported cultural institutions. His real estate group had interests near the museum. Someone important needed to discuss zoning. Each explanation was technically plausible. Together, they were ridiculous. His staff understood long before he did. Marcello had begun asking questions no mafia boss had ever needed answered. Which agency staffed the gala? Who was on the guest list? Was Brooks assigned? Which Brooks? There was only one Brooks. Marcello still asked. Hannah, meanwhile, refused to make things easier for him. She remained polite, professional, completely unafraid. But she never crossed the room to seek his attention. That unsettled him more than hostility would have. If Hannah had been angry, Marcello could have apologized. If she wanted compensation, he could have paid. If she demanded some gesture, he could have made it. Instead, she wanted nothing. Marcello had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people whose desires he could identify. Money, protection, access, influence, fear, ambition. Everyone wanted something. Hannah had walked away from him while owing him nothing and asking for less. That made her impossible to negotiate with, and increasingly impossible to ignore. Then came the Whitmore Foundation dinner. Hannah arrived on the arm of Daniel Mercer. Daniel was 38, successful, charming, and possessed the irritating social ease of a man who had probably never frightened a waiter accidentally. He had hired Hannah for the evening because his recent divorce had turned every formal event into an invitation for wealthy strangers to recommend eligible women. Hannah's job was simple: provide company, discourage matchmaking, help him enjoy dinner. She was very good at it. Marcello knew all of this. He learned most of it within 9 minutes. Luca made the mistake of asking why. I like to know who attends events connected to our business interests. The man imports medical equipment. Exactly. Luca waited. Marcello said nothing else. Across the ballroom, Daniel said something that made Hannah laugh. Not her polite, professional laugh. The real one. Her head tilted slightly backward. Her hand touched Daniel's arm for balance. Marcello stopped listening to the man speaking beside him. Luca watched this happen. "Medical equipment," he murmured. Marcello ignored him. 10 minutes later, Marcello somehow found himself speaking with a donor approximately 6 feet from Hannah. 15 minutes after that, he had relocated to a conversation 4 feet from her. By dessert, coincidence had placed him directly behind Daniel's chair. Hannah noticed. Of course she noticed. Social observation was literally part of her profession. Daniel leaned toward her to whisper something. Marcello appeared beside them 30 seconds later. "Brooks." Hannah looked up innocently. "Rinaldi." Daniel stood and offered his hand. "Daniel Mercer." "I know." The answer came too quickly. Hannah's mouth twitched. Daniel, unaware that he had apparently become the subject of a private intelligence operation, smiled. "Have we met?" "No." That made Hannah look down at her champagne. Daniel continued pleasantly. "I've heard a lot about the Rinaldi group. I haven't heard much about you." There was a brief silence. Hannah rescued Daniel before Marcello could begin investigating his childhood. Marcello has recently developed a passionate interest in networking. Luca, standing several feet away, nearly choked on his drink. Marcello looked at Hannah. She smiled sweetly. Something warm and infuriating moved through him. Daniel was called away a few moments later. Marcello remained. Hannah turned toward him. "Is there a problem with medical equipment?" His expression did not change. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course." She nodded thoughtfully. "Because you've spent the last hour monitoring Daniel like he's transporting plutonium. I was observing the room. You observed him very thoroughly. He's your client." Hannah's eyebrows lifted. There it was. Marcello heard it, too late. "Correct." She waited. "He seems overly familiar." Now she smiled. "He hired companionship." "I understand the arrangement." "Do you?" Marcello's jaw tightened slightly. Hannah almost felt sorry for him. Almost, because the irony was magnificent. "You know I'm working." "Yes." "You know this is professional?" "Yes." "You personally hired me to do exactly the same thing." Silence. For perhaps the first time in his life, Marcello Rinaldi discovered that logic could be completely useless when applied to jealousy. Hannah watched the realization arrive. Then she laughed, quietly at first. That made it worse. "I'm glad you find this entertaining." "I find it educational." "For whom?" "You." Daniel began returning across the ballroom. Marcello noticed immediately. Hannah noticed Marcello noticing. The feared head of one of the most powerful mafia families on the East Coast subtly moved half a step closer to her. Hannah stared at the movement, then at him. Marcello appeared to realize what he had done. He did not move back. Her amusement softened into something else. Because beneath the absurd jealousy, Hannah recognized a change. At their first gala, every gesture Marcello made toward her had been calculated for someone else to see. Tonight, Isabel was nowhere in the room. There were no photographers nearby, no strategic audience, no message to send. And Marcello was still watching Hannah. Not because someone else was watching her, because he was. That difference mattered more than Hannah wanted it to. Daniel returned. Hannah left with him several minutes later because that was her job. Marcello did not interfere. He did not offer more money. He did not manufacture an emergency. He simply watched her go. That restraint cost him considerably more than he would ever admit. The following morning, Marcello summoned Luca into his office. "I need Hannah Brooks's contact information." Luca looked at him for a long moment. "For professional reasons?" Marcello gave him a warning stare. Luca nodded solemnly. "Medical equipment? Get out." Luca almost reached the door before Marcello spoke again. "And Luca." He turned. Marcello hesitated. It was an unusual sight. "I don't want the agency." Luca understood immediately. For the first time, Marcello did not want to book Hannah Brooks. He wanted to ask her.
Hannah knew something was different when Marcello called her himself. Not his assistant, not his lawyer, not the agency. Him. She stared at the unfamiliar number for several seconds before answering. Brooks. Rinaldi. Of course. Apparently, even phone conversations with Marcello began like declarations at an international summit. Hannah leaned against her kitchen counter. "If this is about Daniel Mercer, I can assure you the medical equipment industry remains stable." Silence. Then, unexpectedly, Marcello laughed. It was brief, but real. "There's a foundation dinner Thursday." Hannah closed her eyes. There it was. For one ridiculous second, she had almost expected something different. "You need to contact the agency." "No." That made her pause. "I'm not available privately for professional bookings." "I'm not booking you." Hannah straightened. Marcello continued before she could respond. "I'm asking you to come with me. No mention of a fee. No contract. No jewelry waiting in a velvet box. No 4-hour obligation. Just an invitation." Hannah had spent years understanding the difference between being wanted and being required. For Marcello, she suspected this was the first time he had understood there was a difference at all. "And if I say no?" Another pause. "Then you say no." That answer mattered. More than flowers would have. More than an apology purchased with some spectacular gift. Because the old Marcello would have improved the offer. This one was leaving the decision untouched. Hannah agreed, cautiously. Thursday evening began with another surprise. There was no necklace. A car arrived, but Marcello did not send it as an instruction. He asked whether she wanted one. Hannah declined. She took a taxi. She took a taxi. Marcello was waiting outside the venue when she arrived. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "You look beautiful." Hannah blinked. That sounded almost human. "I can withdraw it." There he is. Something near his mouth shifted. Their first evening together had been governed by terms. Arrival time, departure time, expected behavior, professional boundaries. Tonight there was nothing. And strangely, that made both of them less certain what to do. Marcello was accustomed to controlling rooms. Hannah was accustomed to knowing exactly what role she had been hired to play. Neither advantage applied now, so they had to do something considerably more difficult. They had to be themselves. Hannah discovered that Marcello disliked crowded elevators, but would never admit it. He discovered that she always stole the decorative chocolates from charity gift bags because, in her opinion, anyone donating $10,000 to attend dinner had already paid enough for the chocolate. She learned he remembered every employee's name, despite pretending not to notice anyone. He learned she could identify the exact moment a wealthy man was about to begin an unsolicited story about his golf handicap. Their connection grew in details too small for anyone else to notice. At dinner, Marcello automatically pulled out Hannah's chair. Not because photographers were watching. There were none nearby. Later, when a server dropped a tray and several guests turned with irritation, Hannah was the first person to kneel and help. Marcello watched her. She didn't make a performance of kindness. She simply helped because something had fallen. A few minutes later, Hannah noticed Marcello quietly instruct the event manager not to reprimand the young server. He never mentioned it. Neither did she. That was how their relationship began changing. Not through declarations. Through observation. Marcello started noticing what made Hannah comfortable. Hannah started noticing what Marcello did when nobody important was watching. Weeks passed. Their encounters became more frequent. Sometimes there were formal events. Sometimes there weren't. Marcello discovered that Hannah preferred neighborhood restaurants, where nobody cared who he was. This created logistical problems for a man whose security team considered spontaneous dinner plans an act of terrorism. The first time Hannah suggested a tiny Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, Marcello's security detail arrived 20 minutes early and occupied enough tables to make the place look like it had been seized by federal agents. Hannah walked inside, looked around, then looked at Marcello. This is subtle. Marcello glanced at the 6 enormous men, pretending not to watch them. They're being discreet. One of them had an earpiece. Another was examining every person entering the restaurant. Hannah nodded. Practically invisible. The next time, Marcello reduced the visible security. It was a small concession by ordinary standards. For him, it was revolutionary. He was learning to make room for Hannah, rather than redesigning the world around her. And Hannah was learning something equally uncomfortable. She liked him. Not Marcello Rinaldi, the billionaire. Not the feared name whispered across ballrooms. Him. She liked the man who secretly hated olives but ate them at business dinners because removing them seemed inefficient. The man who could remember the financial structure of a corporation after one reading but once spent 10 minutes searching for glasses already in his hand. The man who had enormous power over everyone around him and absolutely none over Hannah. Perhaps that was why he relaxed around her. She wanted nothing from his empire. One evening, after a charity auction, they remained alone on a quiet terrace while the event continued inside. For several minutes, neither spoke. Months earlier, Marcello would have considered silence something to fill or control. With Hannah, silence felt different, comfortable. She rested her arms against the railing. "Do you ever get tired?" "Of what?" "Being Marcello Rinaldi." He looked at her. Nobody had ever asked him that. People asked about his businesses, his influence, his plans, his decisions. They asked what Marcello Rinaldi could do for them, or what he might do to them. Nobody asked whether being him was exhausting. Sometimes. The answer was so quiet, Hannah almost missed it. She did not interrogate him. That was another thing he had begun to value. Hannah knew when curiosity became intrusion. She simply stood beside him. Marcello looked through the glass doors at the ballroom. Everyone in there wants something. Probably. "You don't." Hannah smiled slightly. "I wanted dessert." He looked at her. "They cleared it before I got there. A few months earlier, he might have offered to buy the restaurant that made the dessert." Instead, Marcello walked inside. 10 minutes later, he returned carrying a plate. Hannah stared at it. "You stole cake." "I acquired cake." "Was there a negotiation?" "The waiter was cooperative." She laughed. Marcello handed her the plate. It was absurdly small, almost meaningless, and somehow more intimate than the $1 million necklace he had once placed around her throat. Because the necklace had been strategy, the cake was attention. Hannah looked at him differently after that. Marcello noticed. He always noticed her. Their first kiss came 2 weeks later. There was no ballroom, no dramatic rain, no orchestra waiting for perfect timing. Marcello had walked Hannah to her apartment after dinner. She made a joke about his driver, pretending not to watch them from half a block away. Marcello looked toward the car. The driver immediately became extremely interested in the windshield. Hannah laughed. Marcello looked back at her, and the laughter slowly disappeared. He did not touch her immediately. That mattered too. The man who once assumed payment, gave him the right to define an entire evening, now waited for something money could not guarantee. Permission. Hannah closed the distance herself. The kiss was brief. Warm. Unhurried. When she stepped back, Marcello remained perfectly still. Hannah studied him. You look concerned. I'm thinking. That's usually dangerous. I didn't arrange that. She understood what he meant. Hannah smiled. No. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Marcello Rinaldi looked genuinely pleased that something important had happened without his control. Then the ballroom doors behind them opened. Not literally, but socially. Because relationships involving men like Marcello never remained private for long. Photographs appeared. Rumors changed. The same society that once treated Isabel Devereaux as his inevitable future wife began asking a different question. Who was Hannah Brooks? Most people were merely curious. Some were cruel. Others began investigating. And Isabel? Isabel already knew the answer. She knew exactly where Hannah had come from, exactly what she had once been paid to do. And as Marcello and Hannah grew closer, Isabel realized something that frightened her far more than their first appearance together ever had. That night had been fake. This was not. The first time Hannah stood beside Marcello, a contract had put her there. Now there was nothing Isabel could see holding Hannah in place. No agreement. No obligation. No price. Which meant that if Isabel wanted to destroy what was growing between them, she would have to drag the one thing Marcello could no longer control back into public view. The truth about how it had all begun.
Isabel chose her moment carefully. She waited until Hannah and Marcello had become impossible to dismiss as temporary. Then she chose a room where humiliation could travel faster than truth. The Devereaux Foundation, Winter Benefit, gathered exactly the kind of people who had spent months discussing Hannah behind crystal glasses and polite smiles. Old families, political donors, finance executives, people who considered discretion a virtue until gossip became interesting enough. Hannah felt the attention when she entered beside Marcello. She had learned to live with it. Months ago, she would have automatically assessed the room as part of her job. Who required conversation? Who should be avoided? How closely she should stand beside her client. Tonight there was no client. Marcello's hand rested lightly against her back, not directing her. Simply there. Hannah looked at him. You know I can walk without guidance. I'm aware. Just checking. His hand remained. Hannah allowed it. That was the difference now. Choice. Isabel approached later in the evening. Hannah recognized the expression immediately. Too calm. Too gracious. Something had already been arranged. Several people stood nearby when Isabel greeted them. Her conversation began harmlessly. The foundation. The auction. Mutual acquaintances. Then she turned toward Hannah. I've been meaning to ask you something. Marcello's attention sharpened. Hannah noticed. Then ask. Isabel smiled. How much does an evening cost now? The surrounding conversation died. Hannah did not move. Someone nearby pretended to examine a champagne glass. Isabel continued with surgical precision. I only ask because I imagine your rates must have changed considerably since Marcello first hired you. There it was. Not whispered. Not implied. Public. Several heads turned. Others already knew. Hannah could see it in their faces. Isabel had prepared the room before she ever approached. Marcello's expression became dangerously still. Isabel. One word. A warning, powerful enough to silence most people. But Hannah touched his arm. Marcello looked at her. She shook her head once. This was hers. Isabel saw the movement. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Hannah turned toward the people watching. Yes. No excuse. No denial. No shame. Marcello paid me the first time we attended an event together. The admission moved through the room more effectively than any defense could have. Hannah continued calmly. I worked as a professional event companion. I still do. Isabel's smile began returning. Then Hannah looked directly at her. I was never ashamed of honest work. The smile disappeared. Hannah could feel every eye on her now. Months ago, that attention might have made her want to escape. Tonight, she understood something. A secret only had power when someone else controlled how it was told. So Hannah told it herself. The first night Marcello and I met, there was a contract. He paid for 4 hours of my professional time. She glanced at Marcello, and he behaved badly enough that I left early. A few startled laughs escaped around the room. Marcello looked almost offended. Badly. Hannah turned toward him. You offered me more money while I was walking away. A man nearby coughed into his fist to hide a laugh. Even Marcello seemed to reconsider defending himself. Fair. The tension shifted, only slightly, but enough. Hannah looked back at Isabel. The first time, money brought me into the room. Her voice softened. That somehow made everyone listen more closely. But it didn't bring me back. Silence. The second time, there was no contract. She looked at Marcello again. The third time, no payment. Then back at the room. Every time after that, I came because I chose to. The humiliation Isabel had prepared suddenly had nowhere to land. Hannah had not denied her past. She had claimed it. The difference was devastating. Isabel's composure finally cracked. Choice? She gave a quiet laugh. You expect people to believe this is simply about choice? Hannah said nothing. Isabel looked toward Marcello. A man like you could have anyone. Marcello's face revealed nothing. Isabel gestured subtly toward Hannah. And this is what you choose? There it was. The real insult. Not Hannah's profession. Hannah herself, her body, her class, her place in the invisible hierarchy people like Isabel believed everyone should obey. Marcello took one step forward. Several people instinctively moved back. Hannah did not. She knew that expression now. Months ago, Marcello would have solved the problem with power. One command, one threat, one social execution delivered so efficiently that Isabel might never enter the same circles again. Hannah waited. Marcello looked at Isabel, then at the room. Finally, at Hannah. Yes, one word. Absolute. But he did not stop there. The mistake you're making, he said quietly, is assuming my choice is the important one. Isabel stared at him. Marcello's attention remained on Hannah. I chose her a long time ago. The room disappeared for Hannah, not because the statement surprised her. She already knew. His actions had told her before his words ever did. Then Marcello did something nobody in that room expected. Something the man Hannah had first met could never have done. He surrendered control. The question is whether she chooses me. No possession, no claim, no declaration that Hannah belonged beside him. He simply stood there, waiting. The most powerful man in the room had placed the only outcome that mattered completely outside his own control. Hannah felt something tighten in her chest. She remembered the first gala, the necklace, the contract, the way Marcello had positioned her beside him as if people were pieces that could be moved until the desired result appeared. That man would have assumed choosing Hannah was enough. This man understood that it wasn't. Hannah looked around the room, at Isabel, at the people who had reduced her to a profession, a body type, a social category, a curiosity. Then she looked at Marcello. She could walk away. That was the entire point. There would be no security men blocking the door, no contract violated, no payment lost, no consequence imposed. Marcello knew it. So did she. Hannah stepped toward him, then deliberately slipped her hand into his. Marcello looked down at their joined hands. The change in his face was almost invisible to everyone else. Hannah saw it. Relief. The feared Marcello Rinaldi, a man who controlled billions of dollars, hundreds of employees, politicians, businessmen, and an empire most people were afraid to name aloud, looked relieved because one woman had voluntarily taken his hand. Hannah almost laughed. Instead, she squeezed his fingers. "I choose badly sometimes." Marcello looked at her. A faint smile appeared. "So I've noticed." That earned him a look. The room laughed. And just like that, Isabel lost the last thing she had tried to control. The story. She had intended to reveal that Hannah had once been purchased. Instead, everyone in the room had witnessed the exact opposite. A woman no amount of money could make stay, and a man powerful enough to command almost anyone, finally understanding why the one person he loved had to remain completely free to leave.
6 months later, Marcello Rinaldi had learned many things about relationships. He had learned that apologies worked better when they did not arrive attached to jewelry. He had learned that Hannah hated white roses, loved terrible detective shows, and could tell when he was pretending to listen while mentally conducting business. He had also learned that being in love did not cure jealousy. This became obvious at another charity gala. Hannah attended beside him. No contract, no agency, no borrowed diamonds. She wore a simple necklace she had bought herself years ago, and a dress she had chosen without consulting anyone in Marcello's world. She also kept her career. That had surprised certain people. They assumed dating Marcello Rinaldi would naturally end Hannah's need to work. Marcello never asked her to stop. He understood now that independence was not something Hannah maintained until a wealthy enough man arrived to replace it. It was part of who she was. Then, halfway through the evening, a handsome stranger approached her. His name was Adrian Cole. Marcello learned this within approximately 40 seconds. He also learned Adrian was unmarried, 39, recently relocated from London, and apparently incapable of recognizing when another man wanted him to disappear. Hannah knew none of this. She only knew Adrian had asked about the charity organization she occasionally worked with. They spoke for several minutes. Then Adrian made her laugh. Across the room, Marcello noticed. Naturally. 3 minutes later, he appeared beside Hannah. Not aggressively. That would have been too obvious. He simply needed champagne. From the bar directly beside her. Despite there being another bar 20 feet away, Hannah noticed. She said nothing. Marcello collected a drink he did not want and left. 7 minutes later, Adrian found Hannah again near the auction displays. Coincidentally, Marcello developed an urgent interest in contemporary sculpture. He appeared beside them. Again. Hannah looked at him. Marcello studied a bronze sculpture with extraordinary concentration. "You like that?" He glanced at it. "No." "Then, why are you standing here?" "I'm considering buying it." Hannah looked at the sculpture, then at Adrian, then back at Marcello. Understanding arrived. "Oh." Marcello disliked that particular "oh." Adrian remained pleasantly unaware. "I was just telling Hannah about a restaurant that opened downtown." "I know it." Marcello had never been there. Hannah knew this. "Really?" "Yes. How's the food?" Marcello paused. "Acceptable." Hannah pressed her lips together. Adrian eventually excused himself. Marcello immediately stopped being interested in the sculpture. Hannah folded her arms. What? You tell me. I was looking at the art. You were interrogating the art. I said nothing to it. You considered buying something you hate because a handsome man was standing next to me. Marcello looked toward Adrian. I didn't notice his appearance. That did it. Hannah laughed. Marcello frowned. 6 months had changed him profoundly. His ability to lie convincingly about jealousy had not improved at all. You know he was just talking to me. I know. You know men are allowed to talk to me. I'm aware. And you know, I came here with you. Yes. Hannah waited. Marcello had nothing. It was the Whitmore dinner all over again. Except everything was different. Back then, Marcello had been jealous of a service he himself had once purchased. Now there was no transaction to hide behind. No professional arrangement. No logical explanation for why Hannah stood beside him. Only choice. That should have made him feel secure. Mostly, it did. Then, men like Adrian appeared. Hannah shook her head and walked toward another group. Marcello watched her go. He did not follow. Immediately. He managed nearly 4 minutes. By the time Hannah spoke with Adrian again later that evening, Marcello had somehow positioned himself within visible range, not beside her. That would have been obvious. 12 feet away, perfectly casual, talking to a senator, while watching Adrian over the senator's shoulder. Hannah caught him. Marcello immediately looked at the senator. The senator, who had been speaking uninterrupted for several minutes, appeared pleased to finally have Marcello's complete attention. Hannah smiled to herself. There was something strangely comforting about discovering that some things had not changed. Marcello was still intimidating, still controlled, still capable of walking into a room and changing its atmosphere without saying a word. But Hannah knew the version nobody else saw. The man who stole cake instead of buying restaurants. The man who had learned that asking was different from hiring. The man who still occasionally treated emotions like hostile negotiations, but was improving. Slowly. Adrian finally said goodnight. Marcello appeared beside Hannah approximately 30 seconds later. She looked at him. Coincidence? Yes. Remarkable. I was already walking this direction. You came from the opposite direction. Marcello said nothing. Hannah laughed quietly. Then she reached for his hand. The effect was immediate. The tension disappeared from his shoulders. His fingers closed around hers. Hannah stared at him. Then at their hands. And suddenly the entire absurd evening became something else. A memory returned. The first time she had stood beside Marcello Rinaldi, she had been paid. The diamonds around her neck had belonged to him. The car waiting outside had belonged to him. Her time had been defined by a contract. Even his attention had been partly manufactured for someone else to witness. Everything had been arranged. Now nothing was. The necklace Hannah wore belonged to her. Her career belonged to her. Her decisions belonged to her. And the hand holding Marcello's had reached for him voluntarily. No contract required her to stay until 11. No payment depended on her smile. No agency expected a report tomorrow morning. She could release his hand, walk through those doors, get into a taxi. And Marcello knew he had no right to stop her. That knowledge was precisely what made her staying meaningful. Hannah looked up at him. You know what's funny? Marcello immediately appeared suspicious. What? You control an empire. So I'm told. Thousands of employees. Yes. Politicians return your calls. Some. People cross ballrooms to avoid upsetting you. Marcello waited. Hannah glanced toward the doors, where Adrian had disappeared. But apparently, one attractive British man can destroy your emotional stability. He wasn't that attractive. Hannah laughed. There it was. Marcello looked at her, and despite himself, smiled. Months earlier, he would have denied jealousy. Then he would have justified it. Then perhaps investigated Adrian until he found a reason to dislike him professionally. Now he simply tightened his fingers gently around hers. Are you finished? Probably not. I assumed. They began walking toward the ballroom together. No photographers waited for them. Nobody important was watching. There was no Isabel whose reaction needed to be measured. No strategic purpose. Marcello stopped suddenly. Hannah turned. He looked at her for a long moment. I never thanked you. For what? For leaving. Hannah's expression changed. Marcello glanced down at their joined hands. If you hadn't walked away that night, I would have believed the arrangement worked. Hannah said nothing. I got exactly what I wanted. The rumors about Isabel had ended. The message had been delivered. The strategy had succeeded. And I was wrong about all of it. Hannah studied the man standing before her. This was perhaps the closest Marcello would ever come to giving a speech about personal growth. She decided not to ruin it. Mostly. So technically, she said, I taught you an important life lesson. Yes. You're welcome. Marcello almost rolled his eyes. Hannah smiled. Then his expression became serious again. I spent my entire life believing everything had terms. His voice was quieter now. Everything had a price. Hannah squeezed his hand. Most things do. Marcello looked at her. But not this. No, that answer would once have terrified him. Now it gave the relationship its value. Marcello could buy almost anything Hannah had once provided professionally. Company for an evening, a beautiful woman beside him at dinner, someone to laugh politely at the correct moment, someone to make photographs look convincing, someone to stay until a contract said she could leave. But he could not purchase this. He could not buy the way Hannah knew, when his silence meant anger and when it meant exhaustion. He could not purchase the comfortable evenings when neither of them needed to impress anyone. He could not negotiate her laughter into existence. He could not command trust. And he could never pay enough money to make her choose him. That decision would always belong entirely to Hannah. Once, that lack of control would have seemed like weakness. Now Marcello understood. It was the only reason love meant anything at all. Hannah leaned closer. You're doing it again. What? Thinking too seriously. I'm standing quietly. You have a specific face. I do not. You absolutely do. Marcello looked offended. Hannah kissed his cheek. Then she began walking, still holding his hand. Marcello followed. The first time Hannah Brooks stood beside Marcello Rinaldi, she was there because he had paid her. The first time he touched her, it had been part of a performance. The first time they entered a ballroom together, every detail had been arranged to create an illusion. But tonight, there was no contract, no payment, no borrowed diamonds. Nothing required Hannah to stay. She could walk away whenever she wanted. Marcello knew that now. More importantly, he respected it. Because money could purchase someone's presence. Power could demand obedience. Fear could create loyalty. But none of those things could create love. Love only became meaningful when the person standing beside you was completely free to leave. Hannah looked at Marcello, then deliberately tightened her hand around his, and stayed.